Welcome to today's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast, your channel for super easy, no-nonsense advice on how to declutter and organise your home. Please welcome your hosts, professional organisers Ingrid Jansen and Leslie Spellman.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 74 of the Declutter Hub podcast. I'm Ingrid. Before we get started with the main part of the podcast, I'd like to remind you of a few things we have got going on in the Declutter Hub at the moment. We have just started with our 40 days, 40 items challenge, where we are decluttering one or more items per day from our homes. It's all taking place over in the Declutter Hub community Facebook group, so come on over and take a look to see whether you can be inspired. If you have more than 40 things to tackle, come and take a look at the Declutter Hub membership, where we guide you step by step through each area of your home with courses, live Q&A sessions, challenges, quick wins, and our community chat. Check it out on members.declutterhub.com. So in today's episode, I'm talking to Sarah Bickers of Free Your Space. Right from the start, Sarah focused on working with clients with ADHD, having on-the-ground personal family experience. She helps her clients to organize their homes and be more productive at work. Sarah loves being an informed, calm, and supportive ally to her clients, and she delivers workshops for clients with ADHD, talks to ADHD support groups, and has recently launched a new training program, ADHD for Organizers. So welcome, Sarah. So happy you're here. I mean, we've known each other for about 5 years now, and we actually both work and live in Southeast London. And we've become good friends over the past 5 years, and I really appreciate you being on the show.
It's great to be here. I felt quite honoured when you contacted me to ask me to come and talk. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, you know a lot about ADHD, and I think it's very interesting for our listeners to learn more about ADHD as well. And who better to then chat to you when it's one of your best mates, so you could just have a little chat on the podcast as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, in today's podcast, we're chatting to Sarah about ADHD and if ADHD and clutter are linked. How many people, Sarah, do you think here in the UK are suffering from ADHD?
So that's a really interesting question because internationally, across the world, there's thought to be between 3 to 4% of adults will have ADHD. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty well spread among, there's no particular people group or ethnicity where it's heavier. It seems to be pretty consistently across the entire population. So around 3% of adults in the UK have the condition. But what's interesting is only about 120,000 are formally diagnosed. So that's less than 10% of the people in the UK who actually have ADHD have formally been diagnosed.
Wow. So
Yeah.
because if we think that we have about 60 million people here in the UK, then if you say 3 to 4%, I'm thinking a couple of million then.
No, it's 120,000. Out of a couple of million.
Yeah,
you're absolutely right. So it's shocking how underdiagnosed it is, and interestingly, particularly among women, because it's only been in the last 20 years or so that people have really started to understand how ADHD affects women as well.
I had no idea. So thank you for enlightening us. I thought it would be maybe if I think back to what I know, I think it would. You always think of ADHD as almost something that's connected to children.
Yeah, I mean, basically, about 20 years ago, people started to understand that ADHD could persist into adulthood. And I think the rate among children worldwide is about 5%. So some children their symptoms are significantly decreased into adulthood, so they don't have persistent problems, hence the slightly lower rate in adulthood. But it's still quite a high percentage. So, it's basically 1 in 20, I think. So that's at least one child in every classroom is likely to have ADHD.
Wow. Okay. I had no idea actually about these figures, so I think that's very, very interesting. Now, in your experience as well, I mentioned in your introduction that you have on the ground personal family experience with ADHD. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because I think that is interesting for our next question as well.
Yeah, sure. So in my family, in my wider family, I had two nieces diagnosed with ADHD, one of them as an adult, and then her younger sister was subsequently diagnosed. And that got everyone thinking about their own families, because there's a high degree of inheritance with ADHD. And actually looking back at my own family life, the home that I grew up in was quite chaotic, and my mum loved a project that she didn't like. She was not very good at doing the day-to-day routine housework, which can be a real challenge for people with ADHD. So there were a number of things that I recognised from my childhood as maybe demonstrating that she had some of these challenges as well. And so one of my children, I got assessed because he was coming up to GCSE age, and I didn't want to miss something in the way that my sister felt she had. So just got him assessed to rule it out. And at the very first appointment, they said, yes, he's very likely to have ADHD, which was a bit of a shock to me. And then subsequently, his younger sibling was also diagnosed. That's 2 out of 3 of my children who have it. So I always say ADHD runs through my family like a stick of rock. So far, I think 5 out of 15 of the grandchildren have been diagnosed. So quite a high rate. It all feels very familiar to me.
Yeah.
The symptoms and so on feel very familiar and have done right from the start. So
yeah. So then looking at it from personal experience and also your experience as a professional organizer, and you work a lot with clients who've got ADHD. Do you think there is a connection between ADHD and clutter? Is there an obvious connection?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few reasons why people with ADHD are more likely to have cluttered environment. But before I start, I want to just say that people with ADHD are not a homogenous group. There's so many other conditions that they might also have, or just different personalities. We know that human beings vary massively. And actually, one of the things I would say is that I come across people with ADHD who are actually very tidy and not very cluttered at all. And often that can be a kind of a overcompensation for the chaos that's in their head, means that they have to be on top of everything. They have to be really controlling about their environment, because if their environment starts to feel cluttered, then that just tips them over the edge. So some of my clients, particularly the ones I'm working on productivity, their external environment wouldn't demonstrate. You wouldn't look at it and think, oh, that's a really cluttered house, I wonder if they've got ADHD. But many of my clients do struggle with clutter, and I think there's a number of reasons why. So firstly, as I mentioned, doing boring tasks is really difficult for people with ADHD, and obviously what's boring to you might not be boring to me, so that varies. But often the boring routine tasks, so for example, hoovering, tidying up, putting things in the dishwasher, keeping on top of laundry, all of those things can be a real challenge to maintain, because they're essentially boring and repetitive. And people with ADHD can activate their energy and attention levels if they're excited or interested in something, but they need that extra kick of the dopamine to actually activate that interest. So doing the boring things is much more challenging for people with ADHD, and they have to really work on that. It's not that they're being lazy. So that's one reason. And also another reason I think is quite important is that people with ADHD, can often be quite distracted, and they'll notice new things, I always call them shiny things, new shiny activities. So maybe they watch a program about learning to crochet or doing zero waste stuff. And what happens is they get really excited and energized by this new idea, this new shiny idea, and then they go out and buy all the equipment for it, and then they don't necessarily pursue it because maybe it's not as interesting as they thought it was. So it's easy for people to end up with all these different opportunities that they've taken on, and they've found it difficult to actually let go of some of those things and say, actually, I'm not doing that anymore. All the same things that we're familiar with as professional organisers, but to a greater degree. So that temptation to take on lots of shiny new tasks can really mean that clutter accumulates.
Very interesting, because I agree with you. We see that in our clients a lot. But it's interesting to hear that it can definitely also link to tasks and well-meaning things they have been well-meaning to do, and then but don't plan out, or I need to investigate a lot more and I need to know a lot more to implement this properly.
Exactly. And I think another point is that people with ADHD will often, that the decision-making part of things is particularly difficult for them because everything feels like it's equal value. It's really hard for them to prioritise between what's more important than another thing. So, you know, that's something that we know makes it difficult to declutter. Decluttering is basically about making decisions. So if you find it really hard to make decisions, that then means that the clutter starts to accumulate. You know, you're not quite sure whether you will take on that hobby at some point when you've got a bit more time. So it makes it more difficult.
Now, I've done a lot of preparation for this podcast, and I've read a lot of the very, very good stuff that you've sent our way. And what I found very interesting was you mentioned something about fixed mindset. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I want to ask Sarah a bit more about that. What do you mean with fixed mindset versus a growth mindset?
So a fixed mindset is when we say to ourselves, I'm really messy, or I'm disorganized, or I'm really lazy. And I think the reason that I think about this a lot in relation with ADHD is because people with ADHD have basically spent their whole lives being told by others or telling themselves that they're lazy or disorganized or cluttered or messy. And what happens is that's a description of who you are rather than a journey that you're on. And a growth mindset is about slightly reframing that. And instead of saying I'm messy, you might say I'm becoming less messy. And that allows you to change and grow and develop skills. And the danger is with people with ADHD, they have often real challenges with self-esteem because they've kind of identified themselves in this fixed way. And one of the greatest challenges we have, and it's a real privilege to kind of encourage people to just, to call people out when they're using that kind of language and actually say, well, you're learning to become more organized, you're becoming less messy. And that can be quite a challenging idea to people because they're so used to kind of having that identity.
So do you really actively listen to what your clients are saying? Because when you pick up on those things, you can change that and challenge that kind of wording they say about themselves?
I mean, that's a conversation that we'll have. So I'll say to people, are you happy for us to talk about this? It's not something I talk about with every client, but part of my role is to bring my experience of ADHD to my clients. And, when you spend all day listening to somebody saying terrible things about themselves, you think, well, this is just one day for me, but this whole lives they're doing this, and they've maybe never noticed that they're doing it. So I'll often just mention it in passing, and then that might lead to a conversation. So
I think because we observe, not only look at what our clients are doing, but we observe and we listen to what they're saying. We look at their faces and about that. We look at their posture, and we see and we recognize things that we can then work with and take it into a positive direction. I think.
It's a conversation, isn't it? It's a relationship and a conversation it's a relationship of trust that we have with clients. And, you're looking in people's knicker drawers and talking to them about all sorts of different, very personal things. You're looking at their filing systems, all sorts of stuff. So these things do come up, and like I say, it's something that I always will contract with them as to whether they're comfortable talking about it, obviously.
Yeah. Now, you've also said something else, and you call it the 2 Ps. Can you tell me a bit more about the 2 Ps?
Yeah, so this is came from observation really over the last 6 years, was just noticing how prevalent perfectionism is among people with ADHD. And you might think to yourself, well, surely if they're really cluttered, they're far from being perfectionists. But actually, one of the main challenges is that something called the all or nothing rule, which is that you either make it absolutely perfect or you don't bother at all. So how this plays out, I mentioned those people with ADHD who can be very tidy, and often they're tidy in quite a perfectionist way. But for many people, what will happen is they'll tidy up their bedroom and then gradually it will build up and up and up again, and it'll reach a tipping point where they think, oh, I can't get this place tidy in half an hour, and I haven't got the 3 hours it takes, and I can't make it perfect, so I'm just not going to bother at all. And then things can get into quite a bad state because you've gone past the point where it feels possible, and your perfectionism actually stops you from just, doing 10 minutes of picking things up off the floor. And the other side of that coin is that can lead you to procrastinate over things. So you think, oh, I want to do this task, I want to, organize it, write this document or whatever, but I'm not sure how I want to do it. And I want to do it really well. I want to please the person I'm doing it for. And so you can just put off and put off and put off doing it until it becomes really urgent. And that urgency helps activate dopamine for people with ADHD, and so then the urgency becomes the trigger, but they'll often leave it right till the last minute until that high degree of urgency makes it easier for them to get started.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely, because I think I've worked with several clients who have got ADHD diagnosed or undiagnosed.
Yeah.
And the filing, in this case, the filing system was quite out of control. And they were like, Ingrid, we want to have the perfect system.
Yeah.
Can you tell us exactly how I need to file?
Yeah.
I want to have your system because you're organized.
Yeah.
And I have a carbon copy of your, and I'm like, it doesn't work that way. Your filing system has to work for you. So we can't put more stuff in a filing system that's actually packed to the rafters. We have to start and do the filing system itself. Yeah. Make sure that the categories make sense and that the subcategories make sense. Yeah. We need to build it around your life. Yeah. So it was either, I'm not going to touch the filing system anymore because it's so full. So I've got now paperwork everywhere. And I'm like, oh no, we need to start with the filing system. And they're like, but that's paperwork everywhere. I'm like, I know, but it needs to go somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is that essentially they're putting off decision making, which is a bit challenging. They want you to make the decision for them, tell them how to do it, because then they can just get on and do it. And doing things, if you set up a system, can feel easier than having to make the decision about what's the system for you. Yeah. So, yeah.
And I think it's always a collaboration, I think, to find out what is important for the client. In this case, the client with ADHD, but for any client, is to build a system that works for them and that works around them, and find the balance in the system and what's working, of course.
Yeah, and I think, one of the biggest challenges working with somebody with ADHD is to put aside that expertise, if you like, you being the expert who's going to tell them what to do, because they've had that all their lives. They've had people telling them how to do something and then them not being able to maintain it. So I always think of it in terms of putting the ball back in their court, empowering them to start making decisions and to trust their own decision making. It's like quite an important element. So, I will make suggestions, but they're always just suggestions. And I always encourage them to kind of bounce back and say, oh no, I don't think that will work for me, because it's really important that people develop systems that work for themselves, and that they're prepared to take a more scientific approach. And I know that's one of the things that we were going to talk about today, and perhaps now is a good time to talk about it. So often with ADHD, as part of that all or nothing strategy, they can set up a system, and then when it doesn't work, they think, oh, that's another system, it just didn't work. And so say you set up a filing system with your client and they find it really difficult to maintain them. And I always say to them, you need to treat it more like a scientific piece of research, where when somebody does some research, if it doesn't work, you don't just bin the research. You think, right, what do we need to change about that research? How could we have got a better result? And I'm encouraging clients all the time to tweak systems rather than just ditch the system. So, if the filing system didn't work, what was it about it? What was it about it that made it work at first? And then what were the challenges? And is there a way that we could tweak this to make it work better and fit you better?
Yes, I think it's very true. And I think That's why I also explain to people who want to become organizers, it's like you can't copy your own house into your client's house. You need to find out what works for them, and build the systems around their life and their hobbies and their work and their day-to-day activities, because then you've got far more chance that it actually works for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit about managing expectations as well?
Well, I think you've already mentioned it when you talked about your client with the filing system. It's that, they're really excited. They've got somebody in to help them, and they often will start off thinking, oh my goodness, I've got a professional organizer in. I'm going to change my whole life. I'm going to suddenly become much more organized. Everything's going to be perfect from now onwards. And so part of my job is to kind of manage those expectations. So if you're a really messy person, you're not suddenly going to turn into a really tidy person. Or if you do turn into a really tidy person, it will probably be at the cost of your mental health. So I'm always encouraging a kind of more gradual transition. And like I said, to talk about the growth mindset, that idea of just gradually shifting things. Because if you start off thinking, oh, I'm going to make my house perfect, and then it's difficult to maintain, then you'll just give up, and then you'll soon be back where you were, if not worse. So again, it's kind of coming back to the perfectionism, isn't it? It's saying, right, what's reasonable? What are we going to change? And even often at the end of the day, I'll say to them, this looks really great, this room, doesn't it, like this? I know it's not going to stay like this forever, and some stuff might start to come back, but you might want to think about, what's your trigger point for starting to tidy up? So I had a client contact me last week to say I'd helped her sort out her room twice, about 6 months apart, a year apart. And she contacted me the other day to say that things had got a bit out of hand, and she'd just taken herself in task, and she just sorted it all out and got it all back to normal. And that is a complete triumph for her, because she didn't need me to come in and do it. She actually took ownership and did it herself. Mm-hmm. And so for me, the triumph for that was that it didn't matter that she hadn't kept it perfectly since I last saw her. What mattered was that she recognised it, had passed a tipping point, and she took charge of it. And so to me, that's a success.
Absolutely. I would definitely count that as a success, because it's so nice that they are using the techniques that we've taught them and that we've gone through with them, and they can now feel comfortable in taking that on board and doing those things. And we're definitely going to talk a bit about shame and embarrassment as well, because there is no shame or embarrassment to ask for help or to get a professional organizer in. I think our aim is not to be in our clients' lives for the next 50 years. I think our aim is that we also then transfer some of our skills over to them, so they can also start to do other projects in their house and feel that they control the clutter instead of the clutter controlling them.
Yeah, and I think people with ADHD, they may come back in the future. And I not with many of my clients, I work with them over a number of months, and then we'll have a little break, and then they'll maybe call me back a year later to tackle a different room, or a room that's got out of control. But there's always that kind of understanding that I'm not going to be shocked by the fact that things aren't exactly as I left them, because we've talked about expectations, and we've discussed all of that stuff during a session.
So do you practice your own techniques, because 2 out of your 3 children have ADHD? Yeah. So you've got first-hand experience, but when it's family, it must be much harder to do, I think, or not?
It can definitely be challenging at times. One of my children, I always say, he leaves a trail of clues behind him. You always know what he's done, because every job he does, halfway through he forgets to shut the cupboard door, or he leaves the lid off something, or so you can go around the house and know exactly what he's done. And it is challenging when you've got people in the home. We all have different relationships to clutter, but with ADHD, it can be quite challenging. And I think I made a decision quite early on that how their rooms was their responsibility, not mine. So from secondary school age, I kind of backed off their bedrooms, and they have to tidy up their rooms once a week before the cleaner comes. And if they haven't tidied up the room, then the deal is that they have to tidy up the room and clean it. So we've got this kind of agreement between us, and it seems to work quite well. It means that once a week the whole house is clean and tidy, and you don't have to worry about infestations or anything like that. But I'm not expecting them to keep their rooms immaculate. But I think that's generally good advice anyhow for teenagers or children at secondary school. So yeah, I think managing other people's clutter is like a whole other podcast, isn't it?
I know. And I'm thinking, my kids are 11 and 13. I've got this all to come.
Absolutely. But I think if they've grown up with some degree of organisation and order around them, then I like to think, I might be deluding myself, but I like to think that they will revert back to that at some point in the future. So my daughter, who's left home, is tidier some of the time than she was when she was at home. Not in a perfect way, but so yeah, everyone's got their own journey with their own stuff, and I think it's quite important, particularly with ADHD. I don't want to spend my whole time nagging my children, because that's just more negative stuff coming their way. I want to make it as easy as possible for them to succeed, and and not be affecting their self-esteem by constantly telling them off about something that's going to be more difficult for them.
Yeah. Well, I think, listeners, that is an excellent statement to close this podcast with. Sarah, is there anything else you would like to share with us in this podcast? I know we're going to have you back for another podcast because, of course, now I'm completely intrigued to hear from you all the practical things that people with ADHD can do in their home. So we're going to definitely do another podcast with you. But is there anything else you would like to add in this podcast?
I think the main thing that I would like to say is not to feel embarrassed about asking for help. And I think it's really natural for people to feel embarrassed or ashamed. And I don't want to minimize that. But at the same time, a good professional organizer or even a good friend who's not going to make you feel ashamed can really help you get on top of things.
Well, listeners, I think that's excellent advice from Sarah. And we hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast and are inspired by Sarah's comments and about fixed and growth mindset, about the perfectionism and the procrastination and managing those expectations. If you have ADHD yourself, diagnosed or undiagnosed perhaps, or if you live with somebody who has got ADHD and all of this maybe sound very, very familiar to you and you think, that's Sarah. She knows her stuff. She knows what she's talking about. She's made a lot of sense to me, and the pennies start to drop a little bit. So we will definitely put Sarah's details in the show notes, her website, her socials. We'll put all of that in. And I know she's got a really good 10 top tips overview that you will get if you go to her website and sign up, and that will come into your inbox as a PDF. So if you want to check that out, make sure you go to her website. We'll put all the details in the show notes. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen today. And thank you so much, Sarah, for your expertise.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Listeners, if you'd like to get more tips and advice, please follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook as @Declutter Hub, and we've got a lively, supportive Facebook group called the Declutter Hub Community, where we chat all things clutter. We'd love to see you there. Don't forget our members area too. We offer step-by-step online courses, live Q&A sessions, and a membership community. If you need some support to achieve your goals and lead a more fulfilled life without stuff being the focus, then the membership is just the thing. Have a look on members.declutterhub.com for more information. If you don't want to miss the next weekly episode, subscribe to the Declutter Hub podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher, and it will pop into your notifications each Friday. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast. Check out declutterhub.com for more inspiration, and don't forget to tune in next week.